Listen carefully, because the most dangerous part of the headline, "She predicted the Iran-Israel war, then she died," is not the mystery, not the drama, and not the temptation to turn this into a conspiracy story. The most dangerous part is colder than that. It's that the prediction wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. Then, it wasn't insider access. It was the output of a machine. And once you understand the machine, you realize something that should scare you more than any rumor. This didn't need a villain, a mastermind, or a secret meeting to become real. It only needed the system to keep doing what systems always do under debt pressure, security fragmentation, and credibility collapse. Before we go any further, lock in one number, because this is the number that turns headline chaos into mathematical inevitability. Reuters reported the Institute of International Finance put total global debt at about $345, $7 trillion by the end of September 2025, roughly 310% of global GDP. That number is not trivia. That number is constraint. That number is stress. And under stress, governments stop behaving like careful planners and start behaving like cornered institutions, reactive, short-term, credibility-obsessed. Now add a second anchor. In its January 2026 update, the IMF warned that geopolitical tensions can disrupt the global economy through financial markets, supply chains, and commodity prices. Translation: the global economy is stable until it isn't. And the isn't comes from choke points, routes, and miscalculation. So when someone says, "She predicted it," the real question isn't who was she? The real question is, what pattern was she reading? Because if the pattern is real, then the prediction wasn't a prediction. It was an inevitability statement. And here is the inevitability, stated plainly. When debt loads rise into historic extremes, when alliances harden into blocks, when deterrence becomes noisy instead of stable, and when governments become addicted to credibility, theatrics, the probability of direct conflict between regional rivals stops being a risk. It becomes a statistical outcome, not tomorrow, not on a scheduled date, but as the next phase of the cycle. Now, I'm going to do something that most videos refuse to do because it kills the cheap drama and replaces it with something more frightening: structure. I'm going to show you a 4-stage mechanism that repeats across empires, currencies, alliances, and wars. And then I'm going to apply it to the Iran-Israel collision so cleanly that it won't feel like opinion. It will feel like a checklist. And before you click away, here's the promise. By the end, you'll understand why this story is not only about missiles and politics. It's about insurance costs, shipping lanes, oil pricing, interest rates, and the cost of living in your own life, because that's where the machine cashes its checks. Now, about she. Don't picture a superhero. Picture a person with a boring job title and a brutal spreadsheet. A risk analyst, a security researcher, an economist who reads incentives instead of headlines. The kind of person who doesn't go viral because they don't talk in slogans. They talk in probabilities. The kind of person who sees the same sequence repeating and finally says, quietly, to someone who will listen, "This is going to go direct." And then, in the myth of the internet, she dies. Sometimes literally. Sometimes reputationally, sometimes financially. Sometimes she just disappears into silence because the system doesn't reward people who describe it too clearly. It either ignores them until after the fact, or it turns them into a character, so the structure itself never has to be examined. So let's examine the structure. Stage 1 is the setup. This is where the world looks stable, but stability is being financed, not earned. Debts accumulate quietly. Security guarantees are assumed. Trade routes are taken for granted. Institutions promise more than they can sustainably deliver. The public learns to confuse normal with permanent. This stage always feels calm. That's why it's lethal. Stage 2 is expansion and overextension. Commitments grow. Money gets easier, or borrowing becomes politically painless. Military footprints expand. Proxy relationships multiply. The system becomes wider than it is deep. Leaders treat credibility like oxygen, because once you are overextended, you can't afford to look weak, not even once. Every dispute becomes a credibility test. Every credibility test increases the incentive to escalate. This stage always feels like confidence, but it's actually fragility wearing a mask. Stage 3 is crisis and loss of control. This is where the system's hidden fragility becomes visible. A shock hits, often not the biggest shock, just the wrong shock at the wrong time. An assassination, a strike, a blockade threat, a commodity spike, a financial tightening. Something that would have been contained in a healthier era becomes destabilizing now because the system has no slack. Communication fails. Deterrence becomes misread. Domestic politics harden. Allies demand action. Rivals smell hesitation. This stage always feels sudden. It never is. Stage 4 is the inevitable outcome. The system resolves stress through rupture. Sometimes that rupture is war. Sometimes it's currency destruction. Sometimes it's regime collapse. Often it's several at once. The specific trigger looks like an accident to the public, but it is not an accident. It is the final output of accumulated constraints. If you understand those 4 stages, you can read history like a blueprint, not as a list of dates, but as a repeated algorithm. Now we prove it with 3 case studies, 3 different eras, same machine. First, the road to World War I. In the setup, late 19th century Europe built a world of accelerating trade, industrial growth, and imperial competition under the illusion that economic interdependence would prevent major war. Finance expanded. Empires treated global commerce as proof of permanence. Prosperity felt like stability. In expansion and overextension, alliances hardened. Germany rose as an industrial and military power. Britain protected sea lanes and its empire. France sought security against German strength. Russia expanded ambitions and mobilization capacity. The system became an interlocked web designed to deter conflict, but those commitments created tripwires. Mobilization plans became rigid because leaders feared being caught unprepared. When you hardwire escalation into planning, you don't get flexibility in crisis, you get automaticity. Then, crisis and loss of control, Sarajevo. An assassination that, on paper, should have been containable. But the system had no slack and too many tripwires. Austria-Hungary felt credibility pressure. Germany offered support. Russia felt compelled to back Serbia. France and Britain were pulled by commitments and fear of a continental hegemon. Mobilizations became irreversible signals. Once trains move, diplomacy becomes theater. And then the outcome. A regional spark became general war, not because leaders wanted catastrophe, but because the structure punished restraint and rewarded commitment signaling. The public saw tragedy. The machine delivered inevitability. The assassination wasn't the cause. It was the ignition point. The fuel was the structure. Second, the collapse of the interwar order into World War II. In the setup, the post-World War I settlement, Versailles, and the broader debt and reparations tangle built a brittle peace. Economies were entangled. Humiliations were institutionalized. Many governments promised stability while sitting on social volatility. The public wanted closure, not restructuring. In expansion and overextension, the 1920s saw credit growth and speculative excess. Political systems became brittle because prosperity was uneven and financed. Nations clung to rigid frameworks, like painful gold standard commitments, because credibility mattered more than flexibility. And when credibility becomes sacred, the system loses its ability to absorb shocks without breaking. Then, crisis and loss of control. The Great Depression detonated confidence. Banking failures and mass unemployment broke faith in institutions. Extremist movements gained power because crisis turns complexity into anger. International cooperation collapsed into protectionism. Revisionist expansion accelerated. Moves that should have triggered unified deterrence instead triggered fragmented responses because the system's political and economic slack was gone. And the outcome. War, not as a sudden decision, but as the endpoint of a world where economic collapse and security fragmentation made peaceful equilibrium impossible. The public saw monstrous individuals. The machine saw something simpler. Humiliation plus depression plus fractured deterrence yields violent revisionism. Third, the 1970s crisis cycle, Nixon shock, stagflation, and energy leverage. In the setup, the post-World War II system ran on Bretton Woods and U.S.-anchored monetary credibility. The dollar's link to gold and America's security umbrella created confidence. Trade expanded. Growth felt stable. In expansion and overextension, U.S. fiscal commitments grew, domestic programs, geopolitical commitments, war expenditures, while dollars flooded the world. Over time, the promise exceeded the backing. This is overextension in monetary form. You can't keep every promise without breaking something. Credibility becomes fragile. Then crisis and loss of control. In 1971, the United States ended dollar convertibility to gold. The system admitted constraint. Then oil shocks, especially 1973, showed how Middle East geopolitics could weaponize energy supply and spike inflation. Economies built on cheap energy and stable money discovered they had been built on assumptions. And the outcome? A restructured global monetary energy order, new recycling mechanisms, higher rates later, recession as medicine, and permanently altered risk pricing. Again, the triggers looked like events. The machine says, overpromised credibility, financial expansion, choke point leverage, then rupture and reset. Different centuries, different technologies, different actors, same 4-stage cycle. Now we apply it to the present so coldly that it feels like math. Stage 1, the setup in our era. For years, the world lived as if financing was easier than trade-offs. Debt expanded, asset values rose, supply chains optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Security architectures relied on deterrence, proxies, and assumptions that rivals would stay contained. And the stress indicator isn't subtle. roughly $345, 7 trillion in global debt by late 2025. That means the world is running with enormous leverage. Leverage reduces tolerance for shocks. It forces short-term decisions because refinancing cycles and domestic budgets become survival priorities. Check. Stage 2, expansion and overextension. Today, the global order has hardened into blocks. Trade is weaponized. Sanctions are normal. Technology is a battlefield. Military footprints and proxy networks multiplied across the Middle East. In an overextended system, credibility becomes the currency of survival. That's why red lines proliferate. That's why leaders speak in absolutes. Because once you're stretched, you can't afford to look like you're retreating, even if retreat is rational. And in the Iran-Israel context, overextension is not just military. It's networked. It's missile defense. It's intelligence signaling. It's proxies and partners. It's domestic politics that punish restraint. It's alliances that demand performance. That ecosystem becomes a minefield of escalatory incentives. Verified. Stage 3, crisis and loss of control. Here's the structural shift that most people miss. In April 2024, Iran launched drones and missiles directly toward Israel after the strike on Iran's diplomatic compound in Damascus. That matters because once direct exchange happens, the psychological and strategic buffer gets thinner forever after. The precedent moves the line. The next incident doesn't start at zero. It starts at we've already crossed that threshold once. Then later in 2024, more direct exchanges and open action reinforced a new normal. Retaliation becomes expected, and restraint gets redefined as weakness. Meanwhile, the IMF is warning that geopolitical tensions can hit supply chains and commodity prices. That means the same crisis that drives escalation also drives economic spillover. Undeniable. Now, stage 4, the inevitable outcome. In a system like this, the question is not, will there be another flare-up? The question is, when the next shock hits, an assassination, a misread signal, a strike that kills the wrong person, a drone that lands in the wrong place, will the system have slack, or will it resolve through rupture? And here's the systemic revelation that turns the title into a warning. In tight systems, predictions are not clairvoyance. They are pattern recognition. So when you hear, she predicted it, don't hear paranormal, hear probability. She looked at the machine and understood that the Middle East is not merely a map of grievances. It's a map of choke points, credibility games, and alliance signaling under debt stress. She noticed that when deterrence becomes performative, miscalculation becomes normal. She understood that modern conflict is rarely announced as war at the start. It emerges from repeated cycles of retaliation until the word war becomes retroactively obvious. And then she died, which makes the story addictive. But the deeper meaning is this. The system kills foresight, sometimes literally, often reputationally, most commonly by burying it under noise. Now let's run the mechanism like a checklist and make this painfully practical. Debt saturation reduces slack. Check. Reduced slack increases sensitivity to shocks. Check. Increased sensitivity forces credibility signaling. Check. Credibility signaling increases escalatory incentives. Check. Escalatory incentives reduce the ability to de-escalate after incidents. Verified. Reduced de-escalation capacity makes direct confrontation more likely over time. Undeniable. That is the machine. And once you accept it's a machine, you stop asking childish questions like, who started it? And you start asking adult questions like, what constraints made restraint irrational? Now, this is the retention moment most videos skip, the part where you feel the machine touching your life. Because this doesn't stay on a map. It moves through pipelines. Here's what the pipeline looks like. Step 1, risk rises in choke points. Traders and insurers don't wait for a full war headline. They price probability, shipping gets rerouted. Travel advisories tighten, contracts add risk premiums. Step 2, rerouting increases time and cost. Longer routes mean higher fuel use, higher wage hours, higher insurance, and fewer ships available for the same volume. That pushes up costs even if nothing catastrophic happens. Step 3, commodities react. Oil, gas, fertilizers, and shipping-dependent goods swing because markets fear interruption. And fear is enough. You don't need a total shutdown. You just need uncertainty plus tight inventories. Step 4, governments respond under stress. If inflation ticks up, central banks hesitate to cut rates. If rates stay high, debt servicing becomes heavier. If debt servicing becomes heavier, fiscal politics becomes uglier. And uglier domestic politics makes foreign policy even more credibility-driven. Do you see the loop? It feeds itself. That's why the story matters, even if you don't care about geopolitics. Because the machine converts geopolitics into everyday costs. Now the final warning, because this is where audiences lie to themselves. They say, this time is different. They say, American exceptionalism will absorb it. They say technology will smooth the cycle. They say globalization is too advanced for old patterns. They say rational actors will step back. But the people before World War I believed trade would prevent war. The people in the late 1920s believed modern finance had tamed collapse. The people before the 1970s shocks believed the post-war order was permanent. The machine doesn't care what you believe, it cares what the constraints are. And here's the truth that raises retention when spoken clearly. You're not watching a single conflict. You're watching a stressed global system searching for relief through rupture. So what do you do with that practically? First, stop consuming geopolitics like a movie. Start consuming it like a supply and credit system. Ask better questions. Who is overleveraged, financially or politically? Who can't afford to look weak? What domestic audience is being managed? Which choke point is being priced? Which step is irreversible? Second, understand second-order effects. Most people panic at the headline. Professionals watch the pipelines, shipping, energy, insurance, rates, and policy reactions. That's where the real damage accumulates. Third, build slack in your own life. That means financial resilience, fewer fragile dependencies, and awareness that stable systems can flip when the structure is tight. You can't control global events, but you can control whether you're living without margin. And finally, remember what she represents. Not a conspiracy, not a martyr story, a warning about pattern literacy. The difference between being shocked and being prepared is knowing the stages before the crowd recognizes them. Now I'm going to end with a direct, urgent call to action, because the next phase does not announce itself with a countdown. If you want to understand how the machine was built, how debt pressure and credibility politics turned local sparks into global shocks, subscribe. If you want to know what happens in the next stage of the pattern, follow and watch the next video. Because the people who survive systemic ruptures are not the people who guess the next headline. They're the people who understand the mechanism and reposition before the crowd realizes the hallway has narrowed. So don't just watch the news, watch the machine. And if you want the exact next piece, how this pipeline moves from a strike on a map to your cost of living, your job market, and your financial reality, then you need the next video. Subscribe now before the next surprise becomes the next inevitability.